Hello, Biblical Mind listeners. This is Dr. Dru Johnson. And I wanted to warn you before we get into today's episode. It's this one and the next one are a little bit different. I do this other podcast called OnScript where we interview mainly biblical scholars on their upcoming books or books that have just been released. It's a great podcast. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. We also have an archaeology channel on that podcast as well. The Material World or the Biblical World OnScript podcast. Lots of things going on there. This podcast, however, seemed particularly useful to what we do at the Center for Hebraic Thought, but for a strange reason. This is an interview I did with Rabbi Dr. Shai Held about his book called Judaism is About Love. Wonderful book. If you're a Christian who doesn't understand Judaism at all, this would be a great entree into the world of Jewish thought. And that brings me to the point as to why we're running it over here. One, you'll just be fascinated by everything Shai Held has to say. He's a great speaker and thinker. Two, I often get the question, what is Hebraic thought? Is it just Jewish thought? Is that what you're doing? And you'll notice that we have Jewish fellows who are research and academic fellows for the Center for Hebraic Thought. And I always say to people when I bring them on board, if they're not Christians, our primary target audience is the Christian world. However, we're happy to have anybody join in who agrees in principle with the project. And for Jewish scholars, I tell them we're not doing Jewish thought. We're not doing Jewish scholarship per se. So when they write for us or participate in things that we do, they're free to bring in Jewish thinkers as interlocutors, as people to help us think about the biblical text. But our primary goal is to think about what the Hebrew Bible is doing and how that pours into the New Testament as well. So the New Testament is Hebraic thought, or it has within it Hebraic thought, as we will argue, and the Old Testament does as well. So I bring on Shai Held. We're going to segment this a little bit into a few episodes so that you can hear what Jewish thought sounds like and how it's not identical to somebody who is thinking from bottom up within the Hebrew Bible out into the world. That the Jewish tradition, like the Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox traditions, put their current thinkers and even ancient and medieval thinkers in direct conversation with the biblical text. That's not a bad thing to do, but what we're doing at the Center for Hebraic Thought is we're trying to think what is the native thinking of the text and then put it in conversation with those other voices. So I give to you Shai Held, who I think is just a great contemporary example of a wonderful thinker and someone who is doing Jewish thought today for the Jewish people, but Christians can benefit a lot from what he says as well. And without further ado, here is that episode of OnScript. Hard question. Does God have a special love for the Jewish people? Or particular love, maybe I could say.
Excuse me. Yeah, so here's the thing. I want to sort of frame this by saying I think there are many Jewish thinkers in modern times who have really struggled with and at times even repudiated that notion. As you may know, Mordechai Kaplan, for example, prominent American Jewish thinker and leader, really wanted with great passion to reject the notion of chosenness, which he found kind of irreducibly triumphalist and self-congratulatory. I start from the assumption that it seems to me the tradition kind of unravels if you just say, I'm rejecting one of its most foundational claims. So what I try to do in this book is something else, which is to say, can we develop a theology of divine chosenness, of God's love for Israel, that is robustly traditional and yet careful to weed out kind of potentially destructive manifestations of that theology. So I would say, yes, God does love Israel with a unique love. And it's important to say, for example, as Patrick Miller, the Bible scholar, has pointed out, Deuteronomy goes out of its way to make clear that doesn't mean that God's love for Israel is exclusive. God also has other stories going on with other peoples. The example of that, just to kind of make this concrete, is God gives the land, Natan, the land to Israel, but that God also gives the land of Edom to the Edomites, etc. That Deuteronomy, it seems important to the Deuteronomist to actually make that clear, right? That God's love for Israel is not exclusive. And also, Deuteronomy goes out of its way in really interesting ways to insist that God's love for Israel is not a function of Israel's merit. If anything, right, the book of Deuteronomy basically
Very
says,
clear.
you're not so fabulous, just to
Yeah.
be clear, right? I love Moshe Weinfeld's formulation, right? The Deuteronomist is worried to repudiate a superiority complex, right? He wants to make sure that doesn't happen. So it's election by grace. It's election that doesn't make love exclusive, right? So, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we can say. I'll mention there's a comment, if I recall correctly, this is something that the Bible scholar Joel Kaminsky actually says in an old article. He says, you can't actually say, I'm going to let go of chosenness and then have the tradition go on functioning as a biblical tradition. So he gives the example. I hope I'm not making this up. This is what I remember. With apologies to Joel if I'm misremembering. You have people, for example, in a Reconstructionist congregation will go up to the Torah and edit the blessing so that it doesn't talk about the chosenness of Israel, but then go ahead and read the Torah, which is all about the chosenness of Israel. And so you kind of, it doesn't actually work. So I think we need to find more and more sophisticated ways of talking about chosenness rather than repudiating it. And the thing that I tried to show in the book is that, or one of the things I tried to show is that often thinkers who repudiate chosenness also caricature it first, right? Which is never a great sign. Like Kaplan's reading of chosenness in the Bible is not particularly rich because he's not able to muster any sympathy for it. And I actually just think if you're gonna, maybe especially if you're gonna repudiate an idea, first give it the best reading it's capable of being given. I don't think that Kaplan meets that test. I don't think Walter Brueggemann in biblical studies meets that test. Brueggemann will say in one of his essays, in modern times we're called upon to choose against chosenness. I understand where that impulse comes from, but I have to say I feel like it's often coupled with a kind of reductive, caricatured reading of chosenness. I think you certainly find that in Kaplan.
Amen. Amen. For me, I think that's captures a lot. Just from a biblical perspective, I think Deuteronomy is a easy place to stop over, and you just read Deuteronomy 5, then 6, then 7 and 8, then 9. It's like, okay, we get it, right? Chosen for a mission for the sake of all the families of the earth, right? Okay, so speaking of the chosen people of Israel, however that mechanism worked out, you prioritize what I think for a lot of people will feel very strange initially, which is that the love of neighbor is that you actually have an obligation to love one's own first and in a different way than others. So maybe you could quickly point out why that is not as horrible as it sounds.
Yeah,
and for some
great.
people, it will sound horrible.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for that. And it actually will bring us back, I hope, to something we talked about a little bit earlier. So first, since we're focusing on biblical studies, let me just say, although I know that there are both traditional rabbis and some modern scholars who have tried to read Leviticus otherwise, I think that on a pshat level, it's basically impossible to read Leviticus 19:18 as talking about anything other than fellow members of the covenant. You have the terms there, achicha, amitecha, right? Your brother, your those terms are all covenantal. So when it then says love your neighbor as yourself, your neighbor is obviously there in the pshat, a fellow member of the covenant. Now, again, I understand why many readers have insisted it's universal, and I'm sympathetic to why they read it that way, but the biblical reader in me sort of says, yeah, but come on, right? That's not a great reading of the text. And so then my next step is, okay, so what might that teach us about Jewish ethics and about ethics more broadly, maybe more importantly? And what I try to argue is that Jewish ethics tries to work with the grain of nature rather than against it. And that means that, of course, you have to honor that human beings have particular loves, what philosophers call partial loves, not partial in the sense of other than whole, but partial as in I'm partial towards you, partiality, right? Of course, human beings are partial in their love. That's part of what it means to be a human being. A human being who loves everyone in the world equally has lost part of what it means to be a human being, which is to have relationships. And part of what it means to have relationships is to be partial to some people. Now, the challenge then is to clarify that when you say love your neighbor, you don't mean love your neighbor and hate everyone else, or love your neighbor and ignore everyone else. It means love your neighbor in an especially intense way. And also, as I quote sources saying, love every human being in the world because they're created in the image of God. And what that enables is what I call Judaism's particularist universalism, a universalism that works through the particular rather than pretending to bypass it. Now, I understand that there's an important challenge here, which is when you legitimate family first, you run the risk of devolving into family only. And for sure, that is a real concern that has to be wrestled with. But I don't think the alternative is to say, oh, well, I will love every human being in the whole world equally. Because A, I don't think that's possible. And B, I don't actually think it's desirable because it violates the very essence of what it actually means to be a person. So, that's very important. Now, here, how does this bring us back to where we were earlier? Is that, Steve Pope then pointed out to me, oh, it's interesting. The Christians who tend to talk about loving every person in the world equally tend to be Lutherans, right? Kierkegaard. He's like, as a student of Aquinas agrees with you completely. The order of loves is essential. And Steve has written about this at great length, right? That there is an order of love. Of course I love my daughter more than I love the kid across the street. Of course I do, as I should. And yet I also have responsibilities for that kid across the street. And that's the kind of move there that I think is essential. There's a funny meeting point, by the way. I'm sorry if this is a little obscure, but a funny meeting point between that Lutheran strand of loving everyone equally and a certain kind of radical utilitarianism that argues the same thing. Kierkegaard meets Peter Singer in a very funny and strange way, and I just think that's not how human life works. A world in which I'm not allowed to love my child more than yours is a world in which I'm not allowed to be a person, and that can't possibly be right.
Yeah, and I think I appreciated how you kind of embedded, you said you want to do a theological anthropology, but you're doing a lot of that work, especially in this section where you're talking about the individual body within the biological family body, right? That you're just born of somebody and have obligations to, and then how that extends out, which to me means that the whole project that you're actually getting into here is also epistemic in the sense of discerning love, that love has to be discerned carefully. And even when you talk about the neighbor versus the stranger versus the enemy, and when you get into enemy love, there's classically famous discussions in the New Testament, and I'm sure in the Mishnah as well. But well, who is an enemy, right? And who represents my enemy today? So I wonder, how do you parse those issues for just people trying to think through, what is the foreigner today, like in a modern context, and what is the enemy, and how do you, is this just my haters at work who don't want to see me get promoted, or is there something worse going on here, and how does that inform our view of love towards them?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I do think it's interesting to distinguish for a moment between love of the ger or stranger or sojourner on the one hand and the question of love of enemies on the other. Um, you know, the hardest chapter in this book for me to write by a lot was around the question of love of enemies. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One of them was this is one of the places where there's a kind of cultural truism that is very hard to overcome. The truism goes something like this, whereas Christianity says to love your enemy, Judaism says, and then fill in something else. Don't be naive, defend yourself, whatever it might be. And as often, or maybe always, when there are truisms like that, my first impulse is to sort of poke at them and sort of ask, is that really right? So I started doing some serious research that I'd never really done before on what love of enemies is taken to mean both in New Testament scholarship and in later Christian ethics. And one of the things I found, which I found really interesting, was that although most, I guess, Christian ethicists, maybe almost all, would say that love of enemies lies at the heart of Jesus's teaching, they've never been able to really agree about what that actually requires. So I found myself kind of literally pulling out a pad and making a list of all of the different things I had seen either New Testament scholars or Christian ethicists say that love of enemies requires. And I looked at this list and I thought to myself, well, that's interesting because most of the items on this list are amply attested in the Hebrew Bible or in rabbinic sources as well. So, I'll just take an example, the ethos of non-retaliation, right? Jews who pray the traditional liturgy 3 times a day, we utter a prayer, to those who curse me, may my soul remain silent. And the rabbis sort of valorize those who are capable of absorbing an insult without feeling the need to utter an insult in return, right? The ethos of non-retaliation. The refusal of schadenfreude, which is amply expressed in the book of Proverbs already, for example. So I found that sort of really interesting, right? Love of enemies, as it's often understood by many Christian scholars, you have that in a lot of in a lot of traditional Jewish sources, biblical and rabbinic. Where I think this gets messy, and you kind of alluded to this in the question, and I actually wish I had made this point more emphatically in the book, actually, now that I, think about it, is that a lot of our discourse about enemies, I think, suffers from our not stopping to clarify who and what we're talking about, right? The word enemy can mean so many different things. I mean, as you alluded to, it can mean, the guy at work I don't get along with. It can refer to a person I was in business with, but I had questions about their ethics, and now we haven't spoken in a long time, right? And it can refer to Saddam Hussein, right? It's not clear to me from a Jewish perspective that what applies to the first two applies in every instance to the third. I think in those first 2 instances, the overwhelming Jewish impulse is to say, yeah, those enemies you have to love. That's like the donkey driver in the book of Deuteronomy, right? You see your enemies, right? Of course you're obligated. That enemy is still your neighbor, you might say, right? Where I think there might be some daylight between, I don't know, let's say most Christian teachers and most Jewish ones is regarding the Saddam Husseins of the world, right? I don't know that most Jewish ethicists would say, yeah, there's an obligation to love Saddam Hussein. And
we should explain for the listeners that Saddam Hussein was the former dictator of Iraq who was convicted of war crimes and executed. Because now we do now have people in their 30s who are just like, I kind of remember who Saddam Hussein is.
Yes,
it's like
I'm
saying
dating
Idi
myself
Amin
here.
or something like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and a truly almost unspeakably awful human being, right? And that's really the point, and so it's interesting. And I'll say that this is, really kind of getting into the weeds of my own writing process. I had been very influenced by a 20th century ultra-Orthodox writer named Yechezkel Levenstein, who says, hatred is always a vice, always and in every circumstance. Anytime you see a biblical or rabbinic source that seems to legitimate hate, you're reading it wrong. It can never mean that. And that's kind of where I was for a long time. And then I started reading a few contemporary philosophers, not Jewish ones and not Christian ones, just moral philosophers, who argued something that really kind of took me aback. And I'm still honestly, several years later, still thinking this through for myself. They basically said, why is that always the assumption? Is targeted hate not a possibility? Is it really true that if I hate Vladimir Putin, it's going to spill over into my relationship with my children? Is that right? Why would you say that? Now, I think we could go back and forth on this. We could invite psychologists into the room. We could talk this through. But I'll say that's where the question gets really hard for me. Is there a mitzvah, if you will, to love Vladimir Putin? I'm not sure that Jewish sources think that. Whereas I think probably, I recently said to a prominent Christian theologian, you think, just want to be clear, you think that there is the Christian ideal is that you should feel love and act lovingly towards Vladimir Putin. And she said, yes, absolutely. It's very hard, but I do think that is what the gospel asks of me. And I said, that's interesting, because that's a place where I think there might be some daylight between the two traditions.
And I think that daylight, and again, that would vary by theologian, right? So I in the sense that neither of us can speak for Judaism and Christianity
Right,
in
of
toto,
course.
right? But I I thought that was an interesting part of the book where you really do think about, well, what would it mean to treat Vladimir Putin lovingly? Would that mean locking him in a room and never letting him get out or have access to nuclear weapons, or you know, like this whole question of, well, what does loving treatment actually look like, and how do you attenuate that per circumstance? Which I think you dealt with pretty well at length.
So, Drew, if it's okay with you, I would love to share an experience that I had just a few weeks ago,
Yeah,
um,
please.
that touched me very deeply. I've been really moved by, as I've traveled the country talking about this book, and more importantly, the ideas of the book, um, the things people have shared with me either during events or afterwards. And recently, I did a kind of public dialogue with a local rabbi, and afterwards, an elderly lady came up to me and said, in a way that I found really kind of, in the moment, kind of overwhelming, she said, "I have a question for you. My husband beat the daylights out of my
Mm,
kids and me for years. I'm curious what you think the Torah thinks my attitude towards him should be."
mm,
Right? And you have this moment where you're like, okay, now we're not BSing anymore, right? Now we're really talking about, like, where God's word meets the reality of human suffering, right? In some really deep way, and it's a very humbling experience, of course, right? And I said to her, obviously, well, actually, I said to her what I think is always important to say first. I said, "I am so, so sorry," right? First thing to say, right? And the second thing I said, which I'm still not completely convinced was an adequate answer, but it kind of gets, I think, at what you just started saying, which is why I was moved to share it. I said to her, I don't know if there's a mitzvah for you to love your ex-husband, but I do want to say that if there is, maybe praying that before he dies, he realize the enormity of what he did and repent is the greatest act of love
mm,
that you could show him. I, we should just be clear that when we talk about a loving posture to someone, that doesn't mean taking them out for breakfast necessarily. It doesn't mean sending them flowers. It might just mean hoping that their soul somehow is redeemed. It might,
mm,
right? So I found that to be just, her asking me that was so, like, disarming, I mean that in, like, a deep sense, like disarming, like I didn't know what to say. And that was sort of my suggestion, and it really goes, what you said is what reminded me of that, because, right, what does it mean to love Vladimir Putin? Maybe it just means, God, I hope his soul, right, somehow understands the gravity of what it's done in this world.
mm.
That's not nothing.
Which in some ways is really putting a very deep seated trust in the ability of God to account for people who can turn from their wrongs, right? This
Mm.
physical turning and saying, I was doing this thing and I now see it, it's wrong, and coming back lifnei, right before God, in some way. Yeah, that's a yeah. I think most of us would be stuck at that moment to think like, okay, speak very carefully. I've had these interactions with people, and man, that's a tough one. You navigated that one well. I give you an A plus.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't the point of the story, but thank
No,
you.
I want
No,
to study under Shai Held's school of rabbinic of handling difficult situations. I do have one last question. I actually have a lot more questions for you, but I'm only going to ask one because we're running out of time here. Um, and that is, I'm just wondering, just curiosity. I'm a podcaster. You've done a lot of interviews and podcasts for this book. You published it with a publisher I'm very jealous of, because I always think those are the coolest books that come out of that publishing house. Um, and I'm wondering what you think is like one of the best questions you've ever been asked in one of these, like a question where you're like, oh wow, that is a really really good question. I wanted to ask you what was the worst question, but I
mm.
Better Angels
Well,
took over.
I don't I don't know if this is the best question, but I will tell you the question that I found myself fumphing around the most, surprisingly, is that, um, a rabbi in Atlanta in a dialogue said to me, "Every really good book belongs distinctively and exclusively to its author. So what makes this book distinctively and exclusively Shai Held's book?" And I was
Hmm.
like, wow. First of all, it's a really interesting premise. And second of all, it's a really hard question. I don't really know what to say. That's not the most intellectually interesting question about the content. It was the most interesting question about the process of producing a book.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and for what it's worth, what I ended up talking about, and not that this is exclusively Shai
Oh
Held,
wait,
but that is
I have just one final question before we get into that. Is so every good book belongs,
perfect.
exclusively to its author. So I'm wondering what makes Judaism is about love exclusively belong and extend from Shai Held.
By the way, Dru, do you agree that it's a really good question?
I I do think I mean I ask similar questions kind of like sometimes, and I didn't do it with you, but I often ask, how did you get here? Like, how did you get to the point where you spent so many hours writing and then rewriting that stuff?
Right. Well, that question I felt I could answer, right? Because I even start out the book beginning to talk about that. The question, for whatever it's worth, I mean, it's really not even that interesting. The answer that I gave him was something about the aspiration to read classical sources really deeply in an emotionally present way.
Hmm.
And that's sort of like, that's what I want my classroom to be about. And I wanted to see if I could really fully carry that over into a page so that I could have that interaction with my reader, even if I'm not in the room and, may never talk to that person.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of questions about content, I mean, gosh, I mean, the question that elderly woman asked me is up there,
Right.
is really up there. People, this is, maybe you'll edit this out after I say it. People have asked me some really hard questions about whether there are any parts of this book I would write differently in the wake of October 7th.
Hmm.
That's been a really hard question to think about.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure I know what the answer is.
No, that makes
One,
sense.
yeah. Anyway,
Well, Shai Held, thank you so much for this book. And the goal you said twice now, I've heard you say to write emotionally present thinking that engages the audience also into kind of a rigorous scholarly way of thinking through things, but in a readable tone. I think you've been remarkably successful. The book is Judaism is about love, recovering the heart of Jewish life. And again, I think for Christians, you will find this an eminently accessible text into some of the riches of Jewish thought and just some of the riches of Shai Held's thinking as well. Shai, thank you very much for your time.
thanks so much, Drew.
I have lots of podcasts I listen to regularly. I don't give money to all of them. I have certain periodicals, magazines that I read regularly. I don't purchase all of their subscriptions. However, there are some that I do give to because I believe in them. I'm more than a listener. I'm bought in on the project. So if you're that person, it's not for everybody. Maybe you want to be a supporter. Maybe you're a fan even of what we do at the Center for Hebraic Thought and the Biblical Mind. You can give at hebraicthought.org/give, and that will take you to both a one-time gift and also a recurring gift. Those monthly gifts really help because obviously, as all of you understand, that stabilizes our monthly income with which we can pay the bills. We thank you for everything you have given and for those who will give and for those of you who are just along for the ride and just enjoy what we do.